back to this dude.
We count 372 scourge marks. That's front and back on the image of the crucified man. We can approximate, because there's no lateral images, that there's over 700 wounds on the crucified man of the cross, or man of the shroud. And what's interesting, he's then asked, this is when Pilate brings him before the mob, before the Jewish mob especially, and he says, "Ecce homo," in Latin, "behold the man." And then the Jewish leadership who hated Jesus say, "Crucify him, crucify him." It's documented, and there's actually some phenomenal hematological studies, Pierce, on the blood. We have type AB blood, human blood, and there's some very fascinating...
What? Why are you advertising for vitamin water?
Somebody asked me what that drink is called, which I always drink. It's called Gleku vitamin water.
It's this new drink called vitamin water, everyone.
Yeah.
Work from an immunologist who I just spoke with last week at this conference, Kelly Curse. It's human blood, it's type AB blood, it's Semitic blood. When the arms are
said Semitic blood,
so long,
or what Andrew Wilson would call magic Jew blood.
and it does look like they're very long, Pierce, because when we believe when Jesus falls to the ground, do you remember, Pierce, from your gospel reading that Jesus collapses under the weight of the cross? He can't even get to Calvary. Simon of Cyrene is tasked to carry the crossbeam. And do you know why? We believe that Jesus had lost 1/3 of his blood volume during the scourging. Let that sit in for a minute. He was dying of dehydration, high levels of ferritin, creatinine, based on the blood samples that we have on the shroud. He would eventually die of a massive heart attack on the cross. The reason his arms, though, are so strangely long on the cross is because his shoulders were separated during the crucifixion, and that's what makes the arms look so long. That's the fascinating part about it. Again, the deeper you go into this, it might sound good in a soundbite to say that. Well, no, this actually smacks of authenticity of what we know of Roman crucifixion in the first century world. The thing that's fascinating me, if I may, Pierce, is the amount of energy. This is what I want to get to, because
amount of energy. So this sounds like he's going to talk about the radiation. But yeah, I've never heard about the amount of energy, if this is going to be mind-blowing here.
This is the latest science and truly breaking news on this program.
Oh, that's why I don't know.
I just interviewed Paulo de Lazzaro. And what's cool about Dr. Aceta and the original STIRP team, peers, that I respect about these men and women, Dr. Aceta was one of 26 scholar scientists who went to Turin, Italy to study this. They're not pastors with a theological axe to grind. They were not privileging this. Even though Dr. Aceta is a believer, they were applying the scientific method. Ray Rogers, who died a great defender of the Shroud, famously said, "Give me 15 minutes in the scientific record, and I'm going to prove this is a complete forgery." He wasn't saying that a few minutes later after studying it, which is really...
Oh, yeah, that was, I mentioned that earlier. That was, all these guys thought this is obviously going to be fake, and we're about to prove it. And then almost all of them walked away going, whoa.
Fascinating to think about. When I look at the power, though, Paulo de Lazzaro is doing some amazing work out of ENIA Laboratories. He is a physicist who works with lasers. And this is something that's gone viral when we've shared it. He has postulated the amount of energy it would take to make a chemical change in the flax, in the linen fibrils, because remember the image, Pierce, it doesn't absorb like the blood does. The blood fully absorbs into the shroud. The image is just 2 microns. Pierce, if you took a razor, you could literally shave off the image on the shroud. It's that thin. It's almost unbelievably thin. And this is what science cannot replicate. And so Paulo de Lazzaro at ENIA Laboratories outside of Rome, the physicist, laser expert, spent 5 years and his academic reputation to say he estimates the amount of radiation energy it took. And to bring the audience along by the hand, at the moment of Jesus' resurrection, we believe this happened, 34,000 billion watts of cold radiation traveling at 1/12 of a billionth of a second.
1.21 gigawatts, ladies and gentlemen.
Literally so fast. And because if it would have been hotter, as the STRP team pointed out, conclusively, this was no scorch. There is no paint. There is no dye. There is no pigment. They published those findings. And in many ways, the STRP team did not achieve their objective. You know, the scientific objective with the shroud is the who, what, when, and how of the shroud. None of those answers have been found. We don't know who did it, how it was done. We can't explain it. We certainly don't have that amount of power radiation to change the chemicals in the shroud. What I try to answer as a historian is why it was done.
Why it was done. I have to say, they need a better opponent for this dude. This guy's way too laid back. They should be jumping in a little more. He should be more aggressive.
Let me
okay, before I go,
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm
please do. Yeah, please do. Well,
Well,
I'll tell you what,
look,
Joseph, just before you do,
Yeah.
Joseph, just one question and a very quick response, Jeremiah. If we assume that everything you say is correct, that it is dated back to the period when Jesus Christ was known to be on earth and alive and operating, and he was crucified and so on. If we assume it's a crucified body that was shrouded, how many people in that period would have been crucified by the Romans?
so it sounds like Pierce is saying, okay, suppose this is a crucifixion victim. They crucified tons of people, so what's that mean? Have to say, lines up really, really well with Jesus, because you have the puncture marks around the head and so on.
Many thousands. They were experts. So remember, the Persians invented crucifixion. Alexander the Great made it great with Hellenization. The Romans perfected it, especially in the Syrian province. We have 21 different records of Roman victims being nailed to the cross, not hung to the cross. What takes it beyond all doubt for me, in 10 seconds or less, the helmet of thorns. There are 50 puncture marks on the scalp and the back of the head, and that makes it beyond all doubt that it's Jesus of Nazareth. No one was crucified the way Jesus was.
Okay, Joseph Assetzi.
This is after Pierce rudely interrupted this guy when he finally decided to jump in with something.
You want to respond to the various things you've heard?
Well, I have several responses, one of which, of course, is that nobody would deny the immense amount of detail in the cloth that matches the gospel accounts. There's no question about that. Getting back to the, I would say, overarching a comment is that if God wanted an image on there, he would have just put it there, and he doesn't have to explain it to us about how it was done. I appreciate the radiation comment that just made, but it turns out that there's no natural radiation mechanism that would give rise to that image. Now, so if it in fact was as the scientist said it was, well, that was a miracle. There's no question about that, and you're asserting that, of course, the image is a miracle in the first place. It turns out that the image content itself by Ray Rogers it turns out to be oxidized cellulose, either oxidation by heat or oxidation by some other mechanism, for example, acid, okay? And that acid plays into one of my theories regarding the 14th century origins of the cloth. So there's a lot more background here in the scientific domain than can be described in this very brief interview. But there's a lot of factors that are associated with the cloth itself. As he pointed out, the image at the time that we did this, what we found out was basically what it was not, okay, strangely enough. It wasn't a painting, there were no brush strokes, and we had no immediate explanation for the image. Subsequent investigation showed, as I said, that the image itself is a form of oxidized cellulose, which could have been, as was pointed out, by a blast of radiation, but it could also.
Okay, so you're saying the image is oxidized cellulose, so that's the browning on the cloth, and Jeremiah Johnston was claiming that it's a burst of radiation, and this other guy says could be caused by heat or something else, or acid. I think he said heat or acid could cause. Wait, so you think the image was caused by acid? I think you might be on acid if you think that's a good explanation. No, I don't know. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think what he would think, like, as far as how they're putting this together. Like, if you think it's 13th or 14th century or something like this, and they're using acid or heat. Yeah, if you were faking it, here's the thing. If you were faking an image of, wouldn't you just like paint it or something like that? I'm trying to think what the motivation would be for someone to make that. I don't know, but we'll see. What's he got?
Have been printed there with heat or with acid. And my thesis, again, going back to the 14th century origins of this, is that the ink that was used at that time to print textiles was an iron gall ink, which is corrosive, and the document preservationists at this time, in fact, worked tirelessly to save documents from themselves, because the ink eventually eats all the way through the cloth or the material that whatever was printed on. So that plays quite readily into my theory about the possible 14th century origins of this image. Okay, it was block printed. It was block printed with iron gall ink. A form of block printing explains all its optical properties: the negative image, of course, the high resolution, and it also explains the so-called 3D property. That's what you get when you, with a carefully sculptured low relief that's printed on cloth. And again, if it's printed with iron gall ink, over time, the iron gall ink would flake off, because linen is difficult to dye and to color. So ink would flake off over time and it would eventually corrode. And that's what we see right now in this time period. We see a corrosion of the surface of that cloth, and that is in fact what causes the image proper. As you pointed out.
Okay, so that's a interesting theory. He said there's a kind of ink that you can use that if you were to draw it on, most of the stuff would eventually flake off, but it has a corrosive feature to it, and he thinks that could make the image.
Before, there's thousands of articles that have been written about all of this. It goes on forever. My position is simply try to explain how this thing was done in the 14th century. And again, if it's a 14th century image, I think that this is a reasonable, has a lot of circumstantial evidence to show how it was accomplished. There's geographical factors. This textile printing was in great development going on just north of Lorraine in France at that time period. They were printing textiles. Somebody who had the skills could have migrated down to Lorraine and created this. There's a confession on record, which of course hasn't been corroborated. Look, the four pillars of authenticity from a rigorous scientific perspective are: one, its age. It has to be 2,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. Two, we have to show that the cloth ensconced the body of Jesus Christ. Three, there has to be some sort of chain of custody that shows that, where was it for the last 2,000 years ago? And four, there's no mention of this. There's a glaring absence in the Gospels of this image. And, you could rationalize all those, but those are hardcore scientific factors that have to be established before.
So it sounds like he's saying what would convince him. Like, what would you take as proof that this is authentic? He said you'd have to show that it's old enough, that it's 2,000 years old, that it was actually that this was the cloth wrapped around Jesus. You'd have to show where it was during all this time. So that's kind of what would impress him.
You claim rigorously that this is the authentic burial cloth of Christ. That's
and just to be clear,
my story.
Yeah, no, I understand, and you've articulated it very well. But just to be clear, if your thesis is correct, and it was from the 14th century, is your supposition in that circumstance that it was a deliberate forgery intended to dupe people into thinking it was the genuine shroud of Jesus Christ?
That's actually a good question. Good question. So what do you believe motivated this? Do you believe someone in the 14th century sat down and said, hey, I'm going to put this together to dupe people into thinking that this is the burial cloth of Jesus? Or do you believe it was made for something else? Again, I've seen people think that this was made for like a play back then, and it just ended up, after being in a fire and stuff and so on, just ended up with some interesting features by luck, basically. But yeah, I'd be interested in seeing what this guy thinks about that.
Well, there's several lines of thought along that question. One of which it was a artistic representation to show the crucifixion to a number of people who were quite illiterate, couldn't read the Gospels at that time. That's one explanation for why. The other one, it was a deliberate forgery that was designed to entice pilgrims to that church in France. And in fact, as it said, there was a confession on record. Somebody said, a priest wrote to the Pope saying that, yes, it's a forgery. The person who did it confessed to me that it was. Okay. And I think the Pope writes back and says, no, okay, you can show it, but don't tell anybody it's real. Well, of course, that was lost. It in fact enriched the local parish a considerable amount because all the pilgrims were traveling to that part of France at that.
So that would be a motivation if you could fake something. And so I guess the theory here would be you drew something on there, and this would get a bunch of pilgrims. You say, oh, hey, we've got the burial cloth of Jesus in our area, and this would cause people to visit and spend money. And then all the interesting features of the shroud that we talk about today would just be some sort of happy accident. Like you use ink to make the design, the ink flakes off, but it had a corrosive effect and therefore left this photographic negative or something like that. Let's see.
Fine. So, the forgery explanation could be a possibility given its 14th century origin.
Okay. Well, look, I want to bring in another guest now because both of my
Hang on. You're going to bring in another guest? This guy looked like he was ready to respond to this stuff.
As am I. So in the interest of balance, we're going to be joined now for the final part of this debate by author Seth Andrews, better known as the Thinking Atheist.
See that? You've got the Christian Thinkers Society or whatever, and then this guy's the Thinking Atheist and so on. Everyone putting thinking in their stuff.
But he had Seth Andrews.
Are you familiar with him?
Yeah.
Was he one of your heroes when you were an atheist?
No, but he was a friend. He was friendly. I interacted with him once or twice.
Oh, okay, that's nice. Yeah, I'm looking at he's only on for a couple minutes, so they just bring him in here at the end, not the way Muhammad brought people to his end, but they bring him at the end here. Let's see what he's got to say about all this.
Andrews, welcome to Uncensored. You've been listening to this. What is your response?
Actually, let me clarify. The Thinking Atheist is an icon. It's certainly not me. I came out of a faith culture. And so it's an icon that represents using reason to try to figure out what's true in the world. And I'm certainly not a great thinker. But I'm an ex-evangelical. I was a Christian broadcaster for 30 years, and now I am on the other side of the faith, looking at it through the other side of the lens.
No one ever asked you your entire life history, man. Talking about the Shroud of Turin. I have to wonder what this guy's connection is, because you're talking about two researchers here. The guy in the middle has been studying it for decades, and he was part of the original research team. You got Jeremiah Johnson. He came on board sometime more recently. What is Seth Andrews' relevance to this discussion?
That's what he's trying to explain, man.
Oh.
Right. So tell me about your view of the Shroud of Turin. Do you think it's real? Do you think it's fake? Do you think the whole thing is just a PR stunt? What do you feel?
You think he's going to say it's real?
Of course, I think it's real.
This is obviously a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus.
What I see mostly around the Shroud is a tremendous desire to believe, to connect dots. And it's totally understandable, people who lean into the Jesus story, but, whether or not it dates to the time of Christ or to the medieval era, and I tend not to discount the carbon-14 date. I think apologists are quick to brush it aside, and then they throw out a lot of fancy letters at the end. But I don't think that we have seen a debunking of the carbon-14 dating of the fabric. But even if it did date back to that era, I mean, we're talking about a time where the Romans crucified hundreds of thousands of people. And so now we're connecting a dot and saying this looks like a crown of thorns. And so therefore it is the Christ. And we root that in the Bible itself and the Christ account in the Bible, which is hugely problematic. I heard references to Josephus. I mean, the Antiquities was what, 60, 70 years after the alleged death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Josephus was not an eyewitness, and the only reference to Christ was not about the crucifixion, the resurrection, certainly not the Shroud of Turin. The Gospels, I mean, they're not reliable because I think the earliest Gospel being Mark was 69, 70 something CE, long decades after these events were supposed to have happened. The authorship of all four Gospels is not known. Nobody has pinned them down. Nobody can authenticate them. And beyond that,
I have to say this. I know he's your hero, AP, but this is just
a very
terrible.
old talking point, and it's a pretty bad one. Sorry.
Yeah, pretty bad. Guys, remember early on when gosh, what's that guy's name in the middle? I don't think I caught it. The guy in the middle, and I pointed out this is an interesting bit of reasoning. He pointed out, hey, something that's interesting about this is that the carbon dating, and he said, yeah, you can explain that in other ways. You can say that the carbon dating was based on parts of the cloth that were not original and so on. So it was a later date because it was later cloth, or you could say it was contaminated somehow. You have different explanations, but isn't it interesting that these details line up so well? Namely, yeah, you can have doubts, but it lines up with when we have historical records of when we know what we're actually talking about, that we're talking about the Shroud of Turin. These things converge. These lines of evidence are converging and so on. Along those, guess what? That is an important way of reasoning when you're dealing with evidence. But following that same line, wouldn't it be interesting? So for me, the by far main issue is the dating of the thing. If it's first century, my confidence in its authenticity would go up to 99% if this thing turned out to be first century. If just the dating was confirmed. But he's saying, hey, even if it goes back to the first century, tons of people were crucified. And so why would you think that this is Jesus? Oh, because of the crown of thorns, but you just have that in the Gospels, and the Gospels can't even be trusted. Okay. Wouldn't it be odd if the Romans, who we have no evidence would put crowns of thorns on people, except for the Gospels, which said they did this to mock Jesus because they were mocking him as the king of the Jews. And so they make a crown of thorns and shove it on his head. Wouldn't it be amazing if the Gospels just made up something about the crown of thorns, and yet the Shroud of Turin had someone with a crown of thorns? And that would be too much of an amazing coincidence there, guys. The Gospels made it up, and yet you have a first century cloth where just by chance, your only image of the time of a crucified victim, he happens to have a crown of thorns on him. That would be too much. You should be looking at this kind of converging evidence, dude, and not thinking that you making fun of the Gospels really answered this issue. So do better next time, man.
The Bible is the same book that makes all kinds of claims we might reject in another context, whether it's giants, 900-year-old people, donkeys that spoke Hebrew,
what does
and
this
a savior
have to do
baby that was
with
born
the Shroud
via ghost
of
sex, if you will,
Turin?
to
He
a
just said
virgin,
ghost sex.
so that the offspring could grow up.
Are you interested
and
in this, AP?
sacrifice himself, blood sacrifice, to rescue us from the very torture
What in
chamber.
the world? What in
Okay.
the world
It
does
sounds
that
like you
have
just
anything
want-
to do at all with the discussion about the Shroud of Turin?
Yeah, we're talking about the Shroud of Turin and whether it's authentic, not your whining about Christianity because your grandma made you go to church. My goodness, what a dork. Not even interested. Let's see if anyone's responding. I don't even know why you. Yeah, I'm not interested in.
Compelling argument against everything you believe about this Shroud, you can respond.
Absolutely. Jesus Christ, the historical record is so clear that in the 89 chapters of the gospel, they all point to that Jesus really lived, he died, and even the greatest skeptics alive of that time had experiences of seeing Jesus alive after he was dead. You can look at my book, Body of Proof, the 7 best reasons to believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and you can see that I never mention the Shroud of Turin. Isn't that fascinating, Pierce? I don't believe the Shroud is authentic because I want it to be, and as followers of Jesus, we don't even need the Shroud to be authentic as our best evidence of the resurrection.
Oh, it's interesting. He's responding to what that dude said about, it's just because people really, really want to believe and they want to be connected to something. He's saying, I don't even use this as, yeah. He's saying I don't even use this as evidence, and it's not required, and we have the evidence.
Sky Daddy.
Atheists ruin every discussion. I'm just going to say it. But if you're a nice atheist and you're just losing your mind right now, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about all the other atheists.
With all due respect, seriously, with all due respect, I mean, can't you come into the discussion and actually just stick to the topic instead of going down this whole path of
Bible fake, Sky Daddy.
why?
Yeah.
Why?
Something along the lines of, he argued that it's earlier than thought, and here's why he's wrong. He said this, but here's why he's wrong. Not just, I really don't, me no like Christianity, me no like it, it's bad, it's dumb. Let me use arguments from 1970 that have already been refuted.
Many other
It's
lines
not
of
an
evidence,
article of
but what's
faith.
fascinating, yeah, exactly. It's not an article of faith. And what's fascinating to me is when you look at the historical records, they stand on their own. Even atheist scholars like Garrett Ludemann said, and others say, I cannot argue with the fact that the earliest followers of Jesus were first hostile to the Christian message. They had experiences of seeing Jesus alive after he had been dead. And they say, now, what kind of experiences those were, we can't explain, but we know those experiences not only changed the lives of the followers, but also changed the world forever. And again, there's such great evidence for the authenticity of the Gospels. We know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. We know that Paul writes 20 years before the Gospels, that incredible passage that no serious historian or scholar calls into question.
1 Corinthians
in 1
15.
Corinthians 15, saying, this is the gospel, that Christ died for our sins, according to the scripture, he was buried, and he rose again on the 3rd day, according to the scriptures. A quick note about Josephus. There's some phenomenal work being done, published by Oxford University Press, T.S. Schmidt. Josephus absolutely knew and had firsthand acquaintance with those who attended the trial of Jesus. So,
This is funny. He's burning him up right here, man.
again, you have your choice. You've got to think for yourself. This is what I do at Christian Thinker Society. You've got to get beyond the sound bites. You've got to get to the substance, read these things for yourself, and you'll be amazed. Christianity doesn't need to be defended. It stands up for itself.
Wow. Yeah. So interesting stuff. Yeah, glad he burned him up there. So for atheist, if you have a commitment to naturalism and so on, you don't want to accept miraculous explanations and so on. He pointed out there, it's interesting, the passage in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul lists an early Christian creed, refers to Jesus' death, his burial, his resurrection, and his appearances to a number of groups and individuals. It's interesting that was argued that dates to within a couple of years of Jesus' crucifixion. It was actually the atheists who were arguing that is our earliest material, and so on. So the point is, if you've heard this as, but the Gospel of Mark is 70 AD, so long we don't have... Okay, we've got something that goes back to within 2 to 5 years of the crucifixion of Jesus. So that's extremely early material, and it's talking about his death, resurrection, and appearances to a number of his followers. So if you want to explain it in terms of hallucinations or something, do that, but just don't sit there and say, but the Christian sources are so late, we have no idea what's going on there. That's stuff. That's why we said this is stuff from like 60, 70 years ago. This has all been refuted. We know for a fact the earliest Christians were convinced Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead and appeared to them. Ask an actual scholar. Ask Bart Ehrman if the disciples were convinced that Jesus appeared to him, risen from the dead. This guy has apparently not caught on to even what atheists,
this is why
atheist scholars say.
This is why some people don't like, some atheists don't like Bart Ehrman, because he agrees with the historicity of much of what Christianity claims, or what Christians believe in, because he knows that it's true, because he knows that the historicity is accurate. This is why they don't like him, and kind of he's not very popular among many of the new atheists.
That's why they humiliate him. Yeah, you had a bunch of atheists who went in the mythicist direction, and
Yeah.
Ehrman made fun of them. Like, do you guys realize how stupid you sound to anyone in the scholarly world? You sound like complete idiots.
Dummy.
You had to break that down. And then, well, we don't like you anymore. We only want to hear that we smart and we smarter than everyone else, and that Jesus was just made up.
We don't like you no more.